So we're Media Next, the media ecosystem, which we're very interested in, and Kay and I are personally very grateful we didn't wear our micro minis to this event for the chairs. So, but we have a terrific panel. Jim Wyatt unfortunately could not make it; he had a last-minute emergency. But we have Eric Mandl filling in. Eric, thank you very much, Senior Managing Director at Evercore. Jeff Fluhr, co-founder, CEO of Spreecast, which I have tuned in. One Direction, and Kay Koplovitz, founder of USA Network, chairman and CEO of Koplovitz and Company, and we are talking about the media ecosystem. We just heard, forget Hurt Locker, you're going to have your bio locker, and you can just sort of, license out your own personal content. I want to talk about just the ecosystem that we see right now. We had Aereo this morning. Kay, I'm going to start with you. USA Network, if you were starting it today, what would your strategy be, first of all, and who would you be looking at as the platforms, especially as more of them are demanding exclusivity, so you can't just sprinkle it across everybody?
Well, I think everybody is demanding exclusivity, and I think that's a real difficulty for media content people when they want to go out. There's no barrier to entry, but on the other hand, being able to market to the consumer is really is a real challenge. And if you're inside one of the big media companies and you have the cross-promotion and that sort of, viability built in, that's really a positive aspect of the marketplace for them. But if you're new and you're coming along, I think you almost have no, unless you sell yourself early on to a big media company, I think you have no choice but to go on an open platform, that is really, I think, one that is growing in popularity. I think with the younger the audience, the more popularity it has, and I think you have to figure out how am I going to appeal to that consumer. Today the consumer is in charge, and they are really going to decide, and they're going to decide whether they want to pay, continue to pay $100, $200 a month to be having everything and your network among them, or as a programmer, even if you are inside that box, are there other ways that you can monetize your programming, because you're going to have to figure out how to do that, because people are migrating to some of the over-top technologies today.
Well, and we're going to talk about that, because I think that we did have something on cord cutting, and so, who should be worried? Maybe USA Network. I'm going to go to you next, Jeff, and just talk a little bit about the model for Spreecast and what was missing in the ecosystem that you saw in terms of the need you're filling.
Yeah, so what we saw, Spreecast is a social video platform. It's all about interactive video content. And one of the things that I noticed when I started the company was there were sort of these blurred lines between content and communication. You look at social media where Facebook or Twitter, everybody's sort of their own content creator, and these are engaging platforms where you can spend a lot of time watching your Facebook news feed, which is really a form of content.
You spend a lot of time watching your Facebook news feed?
Look, I probably am on Facebook, almost every day, maybe every day. So, clearly there's, and it's my, it's information about my friends and content from my friends, but yet it's also sort of a communications tool. And so, so what we saw was, people like to connect on the internet. People like to connect with their friends and family. And in parallel to that, there's this sort of huge growth of video communication with Skype and iChat. But really, those kind of two things hadn't really collided. And so Spreecast is all about bringing that notion of live interactive video to the social and mobile web. And that's what we're really all about.
So it's like the Google Hangout. Is it similar to that?
It is similar to Google Hangouts. I mean, we're different in a bunch of ways, including the fact that Hangouts is very siloed within Google+, so it's sort of a feature of Google+, and Spreecast is more platform agnostic, where we build on top of APIs from Facebook and Twitter, and we also have some different features and such, but there are definitely some similarities as well.
Talk a little bit about just the ecosystem as you're looking at it right now. There's been a lot of hype about certain players, and then, like Netflix, you're never quite sure if they're the Albanian army one minute, and then the next minute they get a really big deal like DreamWorks, and boom, they're right back to being a winner again. What do you see sort of just in terms of the players that are on the radar screen? If you were a cable operator, would you be worried? Would you be nervous about the trends?
Absolutely. There's a very interesting set of processes going on right now. If you're a cable operator and you haven't made a bet to also provide content, you're in a tough spot. But if you have made a bet to provide content, you've made a bet. And what we're seeing, we speak with all these companies on the traditional side and also the Googles and Facebooks and Yahoos and Amazons of the world, Netflix. And their view is that chances are it doesn't even matter what age group. Absolutely, if you're under the age of 18 or under the age of 29, there's a much better than 50% chance you're accessing the internet socially while you're watching content on television. But the stats that are pretty amazing is that if you're over the age of 65, there's a 25% chance. And these numbers are growing exponentially. So the stress for the traditional folks is it's not just how do we provide the content, how do we get to our audience, but our audience probably is accessing the same dumb pipes to access the internet, and they're doing other stuff, and that stuff is very tailored. It's actually socially tailored. So that's a fight that I think a lot of people are making a lot of bets. It's going to be very, very difficult to see who wins at the moment.
One of the arguments people have always made is because whoever controls those dumb pipes is the winner. Is that no longer the case? 4G, everything else, that really some of those advantages from even the infrastructure point of view just aren't there?
Well, I wouldn't count anybody out, that's for sure. I think the folks that own the pipes are in a really, really good spot, but I don't think it's lost on anybody on this panel or in the room that Google has been investing so much money in those pipes to try and be the master of their own destiny. And I think when you start looking internationally where you have a lot of massive economies, massive populations in places like India, Sub-Asia, China, where they've just skipped. They've skipped that physical infrastructure and they're going right to mobile. That level of disruption is going to be very hard to predict, but I think there's a pretty good chance that those next-gen guys, Google, Apple, Facebook, are planning for massive disruption of the core infrastructure that exists in the ground today.
I think that's a certainty. I've felt for some time that the next new networks are mobile, and that's how people want to consume product today. And it's very much true in the developing economy. And when you figure there are 3 billion people on Earth that don't access 21st century communications today, and they will. And they're going to go from the 15th century to the 21st century in one fell swoop. For the first time, they're going to have video available to them. How are they going to consume it? What are they going to do with it? We don't know the answer to all those questions. They're going to be educated. They're going to be entertained. They're going to be informed. There are lots of things that are going to happen as a result of that. They are actually going to be advanced beyond what we know because we have infrastructure built in and we have habits built in which they don't have. So you can go to an African nation today and look at how people communicate, and the women that I know that have businesses there do absolutely everything on their mobile phones, and some of them are only feature phones and 2G, most of them, but they do every bit of their marketing, billing, banking, you name it, contracts, they do everything, and they're very facile with it. And so that's kind of interesting. But I want to get back for a moment to the concept of content, because I still truly believe that really well-created content, very professionally well-created content is still the core of what people love to access.
And it's
in addition to sports.
to make. It's expensive to make.
It's expensive to make. Yes, it's expensive to make in today's model. But those models are going to change. I think when you see, really top talent starting to, launch programming on Netflix, launch programming on, YouTube, launch programming, you can go on, and I wouldn't cut out Amazon from the mix because I would never underestimate Amazon. So I just think we're in a tremendously chaotic, movement in the marketplace. And it's going to be I don't think anyone, I can't predict who's going to win that. I think that the traditional media companies are in a great place, but I've always kind of assumed that the product that they're offering, the charges that they're making to the consumer are going to kind of migrate from the programming side to the providing the internet and pay what you drink. So if you're a big, heavy video user, you're going to pay more
It's like
money
a
than the other
utility
person.
model, basically.
They're
So you'll
utilities.
be,
That's what they're going to. I think really that's the truth, and they have the opportunity. They're flexible right now in the marketplace. They've got both sides covered, but I think that's where they're going to go.
I want to ask about the advantages, and let's take Spreecast. Is your advantage a first mover advantage? Is it a technology advantage? What are the barriers to entry for doing what you do in terms of how easy is it for somebody to disrupt you? I mean, Google has the name, so what does Spreecast bring?
Yeah, so, I think first mover advantage is definitely part of it. I think it's a network effect business, so you get this dynamic where you get out early, you get a lead, and you can build up some critical mass, and sort of a snowball dynamic takes place. I think for Spreecast it's a little bit early to sort of claim victory as it relates to that whole thing playing out.
Go on, you're among friends. Claim victory.
But I think there's probably more than anything else, it's that network effect, which requires sort of first mover. I think intellectual property or technology for what we're doing is important, and it is complicated, but it's not really what ultimately is going to win the game, because other people can do that as well. I wanted to comment on one other thing Kay said as well, which is, she mentioned the sort of high quality content that people love, and that, whether it's House of Cards or, HBO, Homeland or other HBO content, which people do love, and I think there will always be a place for that, and it's going to be expensive, and costs may come down on certain platforms or other such things. But what I sort of see is almost like a barbell, where you've got that on one end, and then on the other end you've sort of got the exact opposite, which is low production cost, often shorter form, or just even social media being on that end of the spectrum, just your Facebook news feed, right? Again, you've got sort of content being produced there every day just from your friends at essentially zero cost, but yet it's very engaging content, or your Twitter stream. So, so I sort of see what's working is in some ways, this barbell where you've got content on both sides.
Let's talk about the different players here. So I'm talent, I'm a producer, and we talked about this. Let's say I'm Kevin Spacey. Given the choice, do I want to be on Netflix? Or do I want to be on HBO Go with the same show? I mean, give me a sense in terms of when you look at these different platforms. One thing you can't say for House of Cards, it didn't generate the level of buzz that I think a lot of these serialized, say Game of Thrones and some of the other series, Mad Men.
Let's not forget that HBO has been in the market for decades promoting their programs, and they aren't as worried about ratings as a
well, there are no ratings on.
I understand. That's why I'm saying they're not concerned about it. They are concerned about promotion, and they have a magnificent promotion machine. And I personally believe that they're the leader out in mobile. I think they were really smart to go to HBO Go. And yes, there have been reports that people have hacked in, stolen, programs. There are, what, 30 million HBO subscribers, 80 million homes that don't access it in the United States. They have a huge gain to make by going to HBO Go and considering selling it to others besides the cable operators. Do they have the strength to be able to take that to market? We're going to find out, but I think that they're really smart to go out there, because you cannot stop the consumer habits and demands. You've got to figure out how to meet them. I consider them a leader in that field.
I totally agree with Kay. When you think about what Netflix did, is they made a very large bet on one very specific piece of content. And I actually think from a buzzworthy or a really cool like BuzzFeed line that you read and you kind of share, it's like, this is an amazing event, but it is an event. And I think what, on one end of the spectrum, you're kind of the dumbbells. It's a great analogy. On one side, you obviously have HBO Go and a tremendous amount of momentum with people that really love good content. But on the other side, I'm a math guy, so one stat that I was just reading is mind-blowing. There's 100 hours of user-generated video that is uploaded to YouTube every minute. 100 hours every minute. So, I mean, these numbers are amazing. And there was a gentleman from Twitter that presented this morning, 400 million tweets. As a
steady... Then you have GE producing train porn, I think is the term
right.
that Beth Comstock uses. I mean, so what about curated content? There's a tsunami of information coming at us, so is there a model where it becomes almost more personal, crowdsourced?
So I guess what I'm building up to is that the kind of the key to all of this is people love to live in clicks. You know, you never like to admit it publicly, but that's just the way human beings are. You kind of, you know, I agree with the way this person thinks about sports. I like the way this person thinks about fashion, and I want to talk about that. Now, what's happened over the last few years is the socialization of that online has taken place. So I think the next really logical step, it's not going to be easy, it's going to be very difficult, is how do you marry what people love to watch and love to share, and typically like to do it at the same time. Now, obviously, I'm kind of leading the witness into Facebook because I think Facebook is positioned superbly well, but I think, you know, the socialization of what your friends like to do influence what you like to do and what you like to watch, and you influence them. So what we're going to see over the next few years is exactly as you said, how do you tailor and customize the content for what people like to do, but what they also like to talk about? And that's not an easy thing to do, but I think we're beginning to see the start of it.
And you know, you brought up curation. I think, you know, there's obviously huge fragmentation of content and proliferation of, you know, first cable TV with 1,000 channels and then the internet with, you know, however millions of channels there are. And so I think what becomes increasingly important in that world, it's very hard to build an audience. It's very hard to create content in that world and get critical mass. And certainly if you're spending anything like the kind of money that's being spent on an episode of Homeland, you've got, you know, it's going to be very difficult to get profitable. But what I think becomes really important in that is curation. And that's why I think they're...
So Oprah had her network where, you know, is that a success story? Because, you know, with OWN, because she had a huge resonance, and then all of a sudden, in essence, it's like Kardashian TV. Here's Oprah's roster of programs that you, Oprah fan, will love.
I think it's a really good example of, you know, people love Oprah, but it's when Oprah's on TV and her audience is aging, and that's what probably one of the reasons why she decided to, you know, stop, you know, call it a day with her television syndication series. But she still has a huge footprint, but not for just anything that's presented. People don't relate to the other programming necessarily. That's why it's very difficult for her to generate and I don't know if they'll be able to be successful at it, but you have to be able to generate interest around the other programs, not just when she's on the air, and she wasn't even on the air when she did her own network when she started it. So I think it's a real lesson. I mean, I could have told you that wasn't going to work. I mean, I know that. I mean, you have to really...
What else isn't going to work?
Well,
what do you look at right now and go, I don't get it? Aereo, is that one? Would you be apoplectic if you were... you know, Les Moonves, would you be saying you guys are stealers?
Well, if I were Les Moonves, I'd be, you know, in court trying to stop Aereo. But I do think that there, and, you know, other broadcast networks, look, I think people love the cable model. I started it with 2 revenue streams with USA. We're the first ones to implement it in the marketplace. We understood you had to have 2 revenue streams, and it's a model that's worked very successfully. So now the broadcasters have been able to now get compensation so they can compete. I mean, why do you think all the major sports on ESPN, ABC's out of it? ESPN programs sports for ABC because ESPN can afford the sports and ABC can't. That's the truth. And so if I were worried about, am I apoplectic about Aereo if I'm a broadcaster, I would like to try to stop it. But I think ultimately it'll depend on the business model in the marketplace as it evolves. I think Aereo is going to go out there and introduce in as many markets as they can, because possession is 9/10 of the law, and they're going to get out there and they're going to say, we're here, we're providing a service to people who want it. And if their technology with everybody having their own little individual antenna holds up in court, then, you know, they'll keep going. Look, Barry Diller's never, you know, he's a backer of that company. He doesn't run it.
There's a rich history of people doing that, isn't there? Sort of like, you know...
Ted Turner took a great advantage of it in the beginning of cable networks to get TBS on the air and went around. And this is what happens in innovation. So who's going to come up with the business model that works? One thing I know, 40 years in the business, I know one thing. You never stop what the consumer wants. You've got to figure out what to do with it. We know that from the music business. We know that at least TV has tried is trying different models. And it is I think one thing that the cable networks have trained the consumer to do, and now in Netflix and at Apple, you can buy the whole series and just watch the whole series in a marathon over the weekend. I think the cable networks sort of trained this consumer for that, and I think that's kind of a big threat for people. And they like the series, but gee, I'm busy. I could TiVo it, I could do this, I could save it, I could do whatever I want, but maybe I'll just buy the whole damn thing and watch it over the weekend, have a marathon of my own.
Given the power of the personal, with the social, give us a sense of sort of what might defy conventional wisdom a bit. When you marry those two together, even some of the surprises in terms of what resonates. You talked about sort of the user content also resonating. We're so used to the big hits. When you look at something like Spreecast, or even when you look at sort of the long tail in some respects as to where we're spending our time, what do you think some of the cable operators in particular might not be getting in terms of engaging their fans?
Yeah, well, to me, the big thing is interactivity. You see, Eric brought this up earlier about people liking to share when they're watching television, right? People, particularly if you're watching sports, anything live sports, the Grammys, a presidential election night, people are consuming that media and they're sharing and they're interacting at the same time, and they're sharing on Facebook or Twitter, and they're kind of going back and forth, and there's this sort of, there's this ability for them to kind of, while they're sharing, kind of interacting with the content and being part of the content. And so I think, that's very fundamental with what we're trying to do, is creating this interactive platform where, look, there's always going to be a lean-back experience. That's why there's always going to be people who want to lean back and watch, watch House of Cards or watch cable TV. But we do know that a percentage of the population likes to interact in their consumption as opposed to just being a passive experience. And so I think that interactivity is a key part of where things are going.
Things aren't always so new. I remember in Sci-Fi Channel, one of the early things we had, because we had very little money to buy programming at first, and we had this terrible series called Mystery Theater, Mystery Science Theater 3000, and the little characters were talking back on the screen. Remember that? Well, that's just because we didn't have. Yeah, I mean, it was really fun and funny and stupid movies that they were commenting on, but it was actually the first feedback, and it was just on the screen because we didn't really have the social network to be able to feedback, but now people just sit at home and do the same thing. Oh, look at this contest for the American Idol. Look at her. Oh, look at her hair. Oh,
well,
terrible.
it becomes Newsac after a while, right? So there is this, I think, the word tsunami is not misplaced.
Yeah.
Our time is winding down, but I want to ask, we haven't even really addressed Amazon and some of the people that are out there now, buying content, creating their own content. But when you talk about how the media ecosystem is going to look different, let's say a year from now, 5 years from now, what should we be keeping our eye on? Give us a sense of looking around the corners as to what's intriguing to you on the radar screen, just sort of quickly give us a sense of what you're looking at right now. Kay, you invest. What's out there on the frontier that intrigues you?
Well, I think you really have to look at who are the players out there that it's making it easiest for the consumer to, access the product wherever, whenever they were, where they happen to be. And I think mobility is a big issue, whether that's tablets, whether that's mobile phones, whatever, smartphones. All of that, I think, is really important to be looking at the investment, because that's the new wave out there, in addition to the players that you mentioned earlier, like Amazon, Netflix, etc. I think that's where things are going, and I think the companies that are positioning themselves to be able to create a business plan that works for them in that environment are going to be the winners, because that's what the consumer wants.
Any winners we haven't mentioned? Potentially?
I don't have any to mention right now.
I come back to this kind of curation concept with the proliferation of content and just the huge number of channels and the difficulty in building audience around that. I think curation becomes increasingly important. So, companies that are able to build an audience by curating other people's content and that are either focused on a specific demographic or are focused on some other value add that may not actually be content creation, but instead is content curation, I think are interesting. Upworthy and BuzzFeed are two that come to mind, but others as well, I think, that do a good job at that.
And do the content creators get compensated in that model going forward?
Yeah, in a lot of cases they do, because they're still getting more exposure on their content. Some of the traffic still comes to those to their own destination sites, as an example. And I think it's ultimately good because they're getting more exposure on their content.
So, I think my prediction would be that the most fundamental thing that's happened in the last few years is that we as individuals, rich or poor, you just get to be your own producer. And I mean, you can be your own producer because you have a great piece of video content that you upload and you get 1 million hits. That's one side. But you can produce your own consumption of data. I'm the same way. I love looking at my Facebook feed. I'm interested in what my friends are doing, but I'm more interested in getting a very, very well-defined view of the content that I'm most interested in. And I think that the traditional legacy folks are going to have to map to that model because the consumer's always right. That's what people are going to want. And they will push. They will push the legacy guys to do it, and I think some of the next-gen folks are just doing amazing things. BuzzFeed, to me, is one that pops out. I think Huffington Post, even though it's part of AOL now, has really redefined the way news is distributed. I think you're going to see the same thing in video as well.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.